So you had a documentary done in complete secrecy because they didn't want any other narrative. You had accusations from two men who had a financial interest in the outcome, and from two men who had previously testified under perjury exactly the opposite of what they said in the documentary. Now, on top of that, the fans and press overseas in England and even in Moscow have begun to point out numerous inconsistencies and flat-out lies that contained in the documentary. And yet, because the laws of defamation are what they are, there's nothing you can do or say. The man can be damaged, his legacy can be damaged, his kids can be hurt, and theoretically, nothing can be done.
I had written an article on cognitive biases that people might have been exposed to in evaluating the Michael Jackson documentary. And I submitted this article to a major media outlet. And they came back with, we love this article, we want to publish it, it's great science, good information, but we're afraid that you might be victim blaming. And I said, well, can you point out what's victim blaming? And they said, well, you pointed out in the article that the alleged victims gave two different types of evidence, and that if what they're saying is true now, that they lied under oath. And I said, I did point that out, and I also pointed out that that doesn't mean that they were not victims. It just means that there were 2 points and 2 bits of information. And they wouldn't accept that. Now, if you were advising me legally, and if I came to you and said, look, I want to write this information, I want to say that there were 2 data points, and that this alleged victim said different things at different times, would you tell me what my friends told me, which is this career suicide? Why are you writing this stuff? You shouldn't be writing this publicly.
Well, I mean, you know, the fact that somebody could say it's career suicide for you to freely express your educated viewpoint is the problem right there. It is that fear runs our society from a corporate perspective. Fear runs our society from a personal, social perspective. And when there's a wave that goes in one direction, people want to go along with the wave. They don't want to risk upsetting the apple cart. And so I would say to you, I mean, this is how we became America. This is how we got the First Amendment. I would say to you, all points of view are great points of view. All points of view are important points of view.
Now, if somebody says something about a living person, ultimately there are laws of defamation. So if the statement's egregious enough, that person can sue the other person, go into a courtroom, and get a judgment one way or the other. But what exists today in our society is defamation does not protect the deceased. So you can basically say anything you want about Michael Jackson, John McCain, Elvis, George Washington, Abraham, anything you want about anybody.
Just getting back to Michael for a moment, because the three of us, which is no secret, are involved representing the estate of Michael Jackson in various litigations over the years since Michael passed away, and John had a relationship with him for 30 years before then, and I had one for about 15 years before then. So when this film came out, the following thoughts came to my mind. First of all, he was already accused by somebody when he was alive who testified, and you might remember Michael was ultimately acquitted, similar charges. And one of the central witnesses for Michael in that case was one of the 2 people now accusing Michael. So if I'm deciding who I want to believe and who I don't want to believe, and I'm in a more structured setting, and you get up and make the accusations, then I say to you, wait, 5 years ago, or whatever the number is, weren't you under oath, and didn't you testify exactly the opposite? So at that point, I at least get to weigh the credibility
Do you think that if you could shape the law, would you shape it so that online we could actually tag well-sourced information, medium well-sourced information, and poorly sourced information, and then use that information in your work? Because it sounds like from the last, from yesterday, that a lot of things happen to people with really poorly sourced information.
You know what? Brian had a great idea for an app.
I think, right, I mean, we're at Harvard. There's brilliant Harvard students sitting here. One of them is definitely capable of creating an app that can go into somebody's Twitter, go into their social media posts, and determine what's truthful, what's not, what's fact-based, what's not. But an incredible algorithm to figure out how to test what's put on social media. So maybe it makes it to the second level. But I do believe there's still a responsibility on the media and corporate America to go further, to take a look at what's real, to pause and listen to the other side of an issue. And if you're only getting one side, if you're only getting one story, that you have an obligation to seek the other side of the story and to put it out there and let the reader decide with full information and full facts.
How do you, in a courtroom, handle the fact that, firstly, humans are mostly incapable of rational thinking? So we like to think we're very rational, but there are plenty of studies to show that we don't pay attention to overt facts that are in front of our eyes.
Well, the courtroom is the easy part, to be honest, at least for me as a trial lawyer, because then you get the opportunity of cross-examination. You get to test somebody's story. So sometimes you can even the playing field. Sometimes you can expose a lie. Sometimes a witness seems unsure, so that people deciding what the facts are, the jurors, or sometimes the judge, has an opportunity to weigh two sides. And if they're not sure, then that person is not to be believed, you get a verdict consistent with justice. And in the criminal justice system, because I do both criminal defense and civil work, you've got to get to the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So if I can show you someone's lied 3 or 4 times, and then they're testifying a certain way, and I say to that witness on cross-examination, wait, weren't you asked the same question, and you testified differently here, and you testified differently there? A juror may say, well, wait, I know he says he's telling the truth here, but he got asked the same question and lied, and then you weigh the excuses of why they lied. It's very different than when you're dealing with media.
I mean, there's an allegation specifically by one of the 2 gentlemen that he was molested on numerous occasions in the train station bedroom on Neverland. And, you can understand that they may get the date wrong. You may understand with that trauma and whatnot, you could get the date wrong, you could get the time wrong, you could get a number of things wrong. But when there's proven documents out there, building permits, that show that the train station actually wasn't built until years after.
4 years after.
4 years after the alleged, abuse took place in the train station that wasn't even built. And you have building permits which show that. That's the time when you start to question, is this true or not? I have a document that's a building permit. Building permits don't lie. I mean, unless something's changed since I've looked at them. But building permits don't lie. People tend to. And when faced with a building permit that shows that the actual building you were allegedly molested in on numerous occasions didn't exist at the time, that's an easy one. I mean, what tends to really work best is investigation and coming out with the information. And a great example of that is the Duke lacrosse situation, where everybody, 100% of the people, other than maybe the team itself and their parents, thought these kids were absolutely guilty, absolutely liable. And there was a 180-degree change in public perception about it. Why did that come about? Because people bothered to dig deeper. People bothered to really interview people. People bothered to put aside their cognitive biases and really dig into the factual information and take a look at time. Well, this is when you got there. Hold it, you said in the police report this, much like the train station. You said it happened in the train station. It wasn't there then. Those types of things, I believe, when the media is able to report on them and pick up on them and put them out there, I think that helps to at least lead to a discussion of it being an open possibility that maybe the Duke lacrosse team is not liable for that. And I think that's where it started, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper, the more facts that you got. But I believe that it's that factual basis, and the burden of proof, in a strange way, shifts completely from you have to prove someone's guilty to now you have to prove someone's innocent.
What's frustrating us about the Jackson situation is it was a documentary that no one knew about. That is, no one from the Jackson side, no one from the estate, no one contacted us for any input. And when I heard the director, which to me was bizarre, but it's the gripe, say we weren't interested in an opposing narrative, it's like, well, wait, if this is a documentary, aren't you supposed to have the opposing narrative? Aren't the viewers supposed to hear both sides and make their decision? Particularly when you deal with a name, or a profile like Michael. So in that situation, if you had a client, if the director had come to me, for example, and said, I've got all this information, I've got these two victims, and I'm going to do this documentary that Michael Jackson was a pedophile. I'd say, well, what about the other people? Did you interview them? And if he or she said to me, nah, I don't want to interview the other people. This is my narrative. This is what I think. My advice would be, wait, time out, man. You can't do that. You got to at least call these people and get a comment from them. So that's the kind, and I don't know how you control that. That's my best advice. Obviously, it wasn't the advice he got, or he didn't follow the advice he got.
We seem to be in a culture of victimhood, blaming and shaming, and this becomes the narrative with which young people are now faced with. And young people are faced with this narrative, and they have to ask the question, what is my identity if that is the predominant message out there? So given that cognitive biases are so rife, and given that the human brain is really quite delicate in managing these, as lawyers, my first question is, in the most ideal world, how would you like the law to address the biases that the media may either consciously or inadvertently share?
Well, I don't know if this mic is on or not. Is that better? Okay, so I won't be able to directly respond, but here's what I want to say. Where the media could really be helpful, in my opinion, is to try to make sure the playing field is even and balanced, and therefore the reporting should be even and balanced. And much easier said than done. The reality is that media today, particularly when you plug in the social media part and you include local media, it's about speed and about getting a message or a thought or some news out fast. And my experience in the last few years, and I've been doing this 50 years, my experience in the past few years are the news is not as balanced as it used to be. And all of us out here, whether we read print, which doesn't exist like it used to, or we're on the internet, or it's Twitter or whatever, gets bits and pieces of the news and generally accepts that as fact, when sometimes it isn't the reality.
With regard to that, do you think that there's a difference between legacy media and social media?
Well, the difference is that social media has a much broader network of suppliers, but they both kind of do the same thing. That is, they get out there first, they want to be the first with the news, and many times it's not as researched and balanced as, in my opinion, it should and could be.
I also think there was a time when we looked at legacy media. Part of the function of legacy media was to get to the facts, to look at both sides, careful use of the word alleged. And I think some of that's gone away today, as I think there's been pressure from blogs and sites that are very quick, that do not have the standards that traditional legacy media did, and it's put pressure on legacy media to act quickly and perhaps not do as much research and fact-checking as they once did.
Here, and I'm curious from your perspective, when you hear these kinds of dialogues going on about social media, and when you are identified as a generation that utilizes social media a lot, can you share with us what your overall impression is of your colleagues and your age group, and how people, like, do people believe what they read in social media? Are they influenced by it? Do they believe in movements? Do they believe legacy media?
Definitely. I think I can speak for all the other students here that social media is, it's something that kind of captivates us. And the idea of having a blue check and being official, or having a ton of followers on different social media websites is, it's something that we really want. And it's almost like it makes you feel accepted by society in a weird way, because that truly doesn't have anything to do with your real friends outside of it. And I think because of all of that, people do tend to go with the flow of what's big on social media. And it's almost like a snowball effect of somebody will say something, people agree with it, more people agree with it, and you don't want to be that one person to go against the grain in fear that it will make you look different or not cool, or just otherwise an outlier. And because of that, people do tend to believe a lot of things that they see on social media. And I know as kids, for me especially, and I think for all the other students here, and probably the majority of the people under 20 years old, Twitter is my #1 news source. I don't read newspapers, I don't, none of that. That's not really my thing or any other kid's thing. It's easy to open up an app and you scroll down your timeline and you get all this information, and whether it's true or false, you don't really know unless you take another step to kind of search and go look at those legacy medias and see what they have to say about it. But people definitely tend to believe what they see on social media just because of that fact that it is our #1 news source. And we'll see something and we're like, oh my God, that's amazing. And whether it's true or not, it doesn't really matter, because in that moment for us it's true, and then it becomes true in our society. And as a younger generation, I feel like we have a really, really large impact on the world because we are the future. And so we start to believe these things, and then other people start to probably believe them with us, and then we get into this world of things that aren't necessarily true. And I'm not saying that everything we see isn't true, but I would say that there's a good amount of stuff that we see on there that isn't true, that we believe, and that kind of, because we all believe it, it kind of creates itself to actually become something that really isn't.
And so one question, I think my next question to you is, have you noticed that political correctness has a different role today than it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Is it really that different?
Well, I recall when we helped Ted Field and Jimmy Iovine set up Interscope Records, and they began to sign artists. And there were controversial artists. There were artists that were talking about shooting the police and describing their experiences in the inner city. There were boycotts. There were protests. We were told that they weren't allowed to put this music out. And it got to the point where Warner Music Group said, we can't be in business with Interscope anymore. We need to get rid of this label. And it was sold to Universal. So now let's look back. That seemed to be the flavor of the moment at the time. But where would we be today without Dr. Dre and Eminem and Snoop Dogg? It's absurd. And the notion that today, that 10 years ago we would have silenced Dr. Dre would seem like That's incredible.
I remember that because I did talk to the Warner people when they wanted to get rid of Interscope, and then you might recall I was at Universal. I left the practice and went to Universal Studios for a few years, and that's when we bought Interscope. And it was interesting to see the two corporate decision makers, both very successful, say, gee, we can't keep this music on our label, and the other company saying, we'd like the opportunity to distribute this music with those lyrics.
There's a narrative out there that once you're accused of whether it's racial prejudice or something in the Me Too movement, that you're automatically guilty, that people have to run away from you. And it's without regard to the laws that exist. It's without regard to the review of what we do on a day-to-day basis, at least Howard and I, in terms of of evidence and reviewing evidence. But the part of it, I think, that is the troubling part, right, is how quickly it happens without the idea of the other viewpoint. So, for instance, on going back to Leaving Neverland, right? If you watch that by yourself and you're sitting there, right? You're listening to one point of view. You're not listening to another point of view. You can't help from a cognitive perspective from agreeing with it to some degree, because it would be like having a trial that the prosecution comes on for 4 hours. They put on all of their evidence and they say, Your Honor, we'll rest. And the judge says, okay, jury, go out and make a decision. That's what watching that documentary is like. Now, if somebody is exposed otherwise to that documentary and then other facts, other information, the cognitive biases and the prejudices that are associated with these issues tend to leave. But there's a big fear out there that it's not about whether you did something or didn't. It's not about whether you're racist or you're not. It's about whether you're accused or not.